Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. Eventually, the people from that world created a mighty nation that has existed from generation to generation down to this very day. That is our nation, the Vile Emperor dynasty, one of the two imperial dynasties that exists in the Eternal Lands, and also, the most powerful. Eventually, the Vile Emperor dynasty took note of the other two statues of the Eternal Sons. They knew that one day, the two statues would break open, and the hosts of living beings inside would emerge. Originally, the Vile Emperor dynasty had intended to welcome the people from the other statues, and join forces with them to fight the great enemy. But before they could prepare properly, the second statue, unexpectedly shattered. The people inside were teleported to all sorts of locations in the Eternal Lands. Unexpectedly, they were not interested in fighting the great enemy. They were bent on conquest, and in the end, the Vile Emperor dynasty had no choice but to go to war. It was around that time that an Archean appeared from within the newly arrived imperial clan. Thankfully, the Vile Emperor was already in that same cultivation level. In order to prevent a horrific situation for their peoples, they eventually made peace. As the old man sighed in the temple, Bai Xiaochun took a swig of alcohol and then chuckled. Bai Xiaochun could see through to the truth almost immediately. The Vile Emperor dynasty had hoped to control all of the Eternal Lands, but the second Eternal Sun statue had opened before they were in a place to do so. The people from within the second statue regrouped and fought back until the Vile Emperor dynasty had no choice but to declare a truce. Obviously, that other major force was the Saint Emperor dynasty. Originally, there should have been 3 imperial dynasties, the old man said with another sigh. I know, master. The third imperial dynasty was supposed to be the Arch-Emperor dynasty. Hasn't everyone been saying that the third Eternal Sun statue shattered recently? When Bai Xiaochun heard the boy's words, he looked down at the alcohol jug, his hand trembling. Sadly, the third Eternal Sun statue was supposed to produce the Arch-Emperor dynasty. But it shattered far too late. Right now, the Vile Emperor dynasty essentially controls 3 of the immortal domains. There are 2 immortal domains that are mostly under the control of Saint Emperor City, which the Vile Emperor dynasty can't do anything about. The only thing the Arch-Emperor dynasty people are good for now is to bolster the forces of the other 2 imperial dynasties. In any case, the end goal of it all is to deal with the great enemy from beyond. Of course, the sanctimonious Saint Emperor dynasty is weak and useless. Our Vile Emperor dynasty is the true strength of the Eternal Lands, and its only hope. By the time the old man got to the last part of his speech, his voice resonated with devotion and zeal. Bai Xiaochun lay there slumped against the wall, hand trembling as he lifted the alcohol jug and took another drink, hoping that he would soon be numb to the bitterness that dwelled in his heart. This town was in the third immortal domain, which was controlled by the Vile Emperor dynasty. The 5 immortal domains in the Eternal Lands were all roughly the same size, each one vastly larger than the Heavenspan realm. In fact, the Heavenspan realm would only count as one of the many prefectures that existed within a given immortal domain. Each immortal domain had dozens of prefectures. Within the prefectures were dozens of counties, and within the counties were hundreds of cities and towns of varying sizes. The little town that Bai Xiaochun was in was just such a place. In the Eternal Lands, the relationship between cultivators and mortals was somewhat different than in the Heavenspan realm. Here, the cultivators took care of the mortals, as well as the land itself. Each immortal domain was ruled by a celestial, whose subordinates, the demigods, would oversee the prefectures. Of course, the demigods had subordinates too, devas who ran the various counties. Usually, nascent soul experts would be in charge of the larger cities, with the smaller locations occasionally being run by core formation cultivators. Not every celestial would be appointed to serve as the ruler of an immortal domain. For example, in the Vile Emperor dynasty, there were only 3 celestials with such responsibility, while the other handful remained stationed in Vile Emperor City. And the Vile Emperor himself was in charge of Vile Emperor City and the areas surrounding it. The Eternal Lands, Bai Xiaochun murmured. Whether it was in terms of sheer size or the number of powerful experts present, the Eternal Lands vastly surpassed the Heavenspan realm. People like Taoist Heavenspan who had not yet become true celestials, were by no means rare. Only by reaching the Mahayana realm and becoming celestials could someone truly be counted as a powerful expert in the Eternal Lands. Above the celestial realm was the Archean realm. That was a terrifying level, and in all of the Eternal Lands, there were only 2 such people, the 2 emperors. From what Bai Xiaochun could tell, quasi-Archeans were people in the great circle of the celestial realm, or people who had failed to actually become Archeans. I wonder where that laughing crying ghost face came from originally, he thought. Then he shook his head. Every time his thoughts strayed to such matters, many images would appear in his mind. He would see friends and family from the heavenspan realm, people that he had been unable to find. During his first few months of searching, it had been easy to track down the aura of the heavenspan realm. He had found corpses of strangers, and some who were familiar faces. Each time he had trembled and looked up into the sky, heart-racked with grief. At some point, the old man and the boy moved on from the temple. When they did, the boy couldn't conceal his excitement at having gained enlightenment of his magical technique. Eventually, the sun set. Bai Xiaochun was still lying there against the temple wall, as drunk as ever. He almost looked like he was asleep. Usually, he would only leave this spot when he ran out of alcohol. Then he would stagger over to the tavern to buy more, then come back to the temple, lean up against the wall, and watch the sun rising and setting, or look up at the strange hands and the evil face in the sky. Days turned into a blur. Bai Xiaochun had no idea how much time had passed. He had a scraggly beard now, and his clothing was so dirty it threatened to turn black. He no longer thought about the past. Unwilling to deal with the pain, he entered a state of almost complete mental blankness. Sometimes a dried-up leaf would land in front of him, and he would stare at it for the entire day. It was almost as if by looking at the leaf, he could see all of the happiness, anger, sorrow, and joy it had experienced in its life. One thing he loved was when night fell and, from his spot at the temple, he could see lamplight filling the little town. Each of those flickering lamps represented a family. He looked at them until his tears ran dry. Sadly, the lamp of his heart seemed impossible to spark to life. One autumn night, thunder rumbled in the sky, and great, bean-sized drops of rain began to fall, almost as cold as ice. Clearly, winter was on the way. Bai Xiaochun looked up into the night, and the rain splashed onto his face. For the first time, he actually felt cold. However, it was also in that same moment that he looked down at the back of his hand, to the spark-shaped scar that was the spot where Bai Hao had perished. "It's warm," he said. It had been a long time since he spoke out loud, and the feeling was strange. As he looked down at his hand, his disheveled hair fell down to cover his face, and yet, it couldn't cover the confused shock in his eyes. He suddenly began to pant. "It's warm?" Shivering, he lifted his hand up until it was right in front of his nose. For the first time in a long time, his eyes were not cloudy and dim, but rather, shone with the bright light of surprise. Deep within his gaze, a stubborn determination suddenly erupted to life. "It's warm," he exclaimed in a quavering voice. Unable to stop his hand from shaking, he sent some divine sense into it, and specifically, the spark-shaped mark on it. He had done this on numerous occasions before, but his divine sense had never detected anything in particular. But now it did. All of a sudden, his dry eyes began to overflow with tears. "Howard, you're not dead." All of a sudden, mad excitement rose up inside of him. Up above, thunder crashed, but it was like nothing compared to what was happening inside his mind and heart. He could sense Bai Hao's aura. Deep inside the mark on his hand, he could sense Bai Hao as an incredibly weak discarnate soul. He was as fragile as a candle flickering in the wind. And yet, within that weakness, he showed a tenacious refusal to be destroyed. Unfortunately, it would be many years before he managed to grow strong and recover. Shaking physically, Bai Xiaochun grabbed one hand with the other and then pushed them both up against his chest. Considering his unkempt hair and scraggly beard, he looked very much like a destitute beggar who had just found the most precious of gems. As the rain fell down on him, it was for the first time since he arrived in the Eternal Lands, that he smiled. "Howard," he murmured in excitement. He smiled as excitedly as a child would, a smile that had appeared often in the heavenspan realm, but after everything he had experienced, had become as rare as a jewel. In his state of despondency, the fluctuations of Bai Hao's soul became something like a burning lantern on a dark night. Despite how wet and freezing it was that night, Bai Xiaochun felt warm. Back in the wildlands, master and apprentice had depended on each other for survival as they ran their little spirit enhancement shop, and it was that memory which suddenly brought Bai Xiaochun to his senses. It was almost like the sun rising up from the horizon. He looked back down at his hand, and suddenly wondered if he was dreaming. Therefore, he probed at the scar on his hand over and over again to make sure. Finally, he breathed a long sigh. Bai Hao was definitely not dead. Or perhaps it was most appropriate to say that his soul had not fully dispersed. Perhaps it was something the gravekeeper had done, or perhaps it was Bai Hao's own determination. Either way, he had somehow survived as a discarnate soul. Bai Xiaochun had reached out to try to grab Bai Hao, only to have a tiny spark fall down onto the back of his hand. And that spark was the discarnate soul. 1. It was so weak that it seemed it might vanish at any moment. And yet there it was, inside the scar. Due to the string of catastrophic events that had ended in the destruction of the Heavenspan realm, Bai Xiaochun had never sensed the oh-so-weak fluctuations of the soul. But now, in this tiny town, in his moment of quiet despair, as he sat there watching the sun rise and set, he suddenly sensed something in the mark on the back of his hand. "You're still with me," he murmured. A bit of pain and bitterness could be seen in his smile as he lifted his alcohol jug up to take another drink. It was almost empty. This drunken immortal is good stuff, however. Rubbing his aching temples, he began to head toward the tavern again. As he walked along, talking to himself and drinking, the other people on the street would look at him with strange expressions, and hurry to get out of his way. Scholar Bai is crazy, he's started talking to himself. Who is this Bai Hao fellow? His assistant or something? You can't help but feel sorry for him. Bai Xiaochun ignored all the townsfolk pointing and whispering about him. Before, he had been all alone in the world, but now, he had Bai Hao to accompany him. His whole day was spent drinking and talking to his apprentice, until he eventually staggered back to the temple and leaned up against the crumbling wall. There, he stared up blankly into the sky again. The fluctuations of Bai Hao's soul were like a lamp on a dark night, casting light out into the world. Before, Bai Xiaochun had been unwilling to consider what the future held, but now, he began to ponder just that. "How, what do you think Master should do? Maybe I should look for people from the Heavenspan realm. But, I already looked. From the moment I woke up, I started looking. All I found were corpses. How, do you remember Beihan Lai? Oh right, you never met him. Well, I found his corpse." Bai Xiaochun shook his head and smiled bitterly. Then he took another drink. "I don't want to keep looking. But what else am I supposed to do in this strange, unfamiliar world? I wish you could wake up. You would definitely have some great ideas. You always do." Bai Xiaochun sighed and looked up at the setting sun, and the amber glow which it cast out across the sky. It was almost dark when he decided that he needed more alcohol. Like usual, he crawled to his feet and headed toward the tavern, where he got another jug. By the time he headed back out into the dark, he was already drunk again. Ah, the drunken life. That's how to be happy. He threw his head back and laughed heartily, then suddenly started crying. By the time he staggered back to the temple, he was out of energy, and collapsed face first onto the ground. His jug rolled off to the side, spilling quite a bit of alcohol. There were a few lamps lit within the little town, but none of them were strong enough to illuminate the ruins of the temple. A biting wind kicked up, and whether it was the rustling of the withered leaves that blew through the air, or the whisper of the bamboo forests around the village, it all sounded very desolate. The night grew darker, and the wind picked up. Eventually, one particularly strong gust of wind pushed the empty jug of alcohol into motion. It rolled off to the side and down into a nearby ditch, where a foot suddenly stepped down onto it, crushing it into the mud. That drunkard is going to drink himself to death sooner or later. You know, he must be pretty rich. Think about it. He's been drinking for months and months, but still has money to spend. We're actually doing a good thing here. His money would do a lot more good in our pockets than it would being wasted by him, drinking himself to death. Let's just send him off early to reunite with his dead family." 3 local ruffians emerged from the nearby bamboo forest, joking greedily amongst themselves as they tromped over to the temple. They were members of a local gang, mortals who had long since taken notice of Bai Xiaochun. Originally, they hadn't given him much thought, but when they realized that he continually bought drunken immortal and never seemed to run out of money, their interest was piqued. To ruffians like this, a drunkard with deep pockets was like a fat sheep waiting to be slaughtered. Only one of the ruffians actually approached Bai Xiaochun. The other 2 fanned out to act as lookouts. As far as they were concerned, any of them could single-handedly take care of a single drunken scholar. One of the ruffians standing watch chuckled and said, "Hurry up and kill him, Sun Wu. Then we can take the loot to the pink and lace pavilion and have a real good time." The one they called Sun Wu didn't hesitate. He walked over to where Bai Xiaochun lay on the ground outside the temple and squatted down next to him. "The sooner you die, Scholar Bai, the sooner you can be reincarnated. I'm just helping you out here." With that, he reached into the fold of his robe and pulled out a dagger, which he placed right over Bai Xiaochun's heart. Because of the life of crime they had led, these 3 ruffians had done things that most ordinary people had not. They had taken lives in the past, and although they couldn't be considered particularly powerful or dangerous, were vicious and merciless to the core. They had never even considered sparing Bai Xiaochun's life. He was an outsider, so if he died, no one would care too much. On the other hand, if they robbed him but left him alive, and he reported the theft to the authorities, it could cause them a big headache. The moonlight caught the dagger, causing it to glint in sinister fashion. Sun Wu smiled coldly, but then realized that considering the scholar might awaken from the pain, he reached down and clamped his hand over his mouth. He had killed people in this way before. However, something different happened this time. As he tried to plunge the knife into Bai Xiaochun's chest, it felt like he had struck a slab of metal. He pushed harder, but then let out a yelp of shock and pain as the dagger snapped in half. To Sun Wu's shock, his forefinger was cut by the broken dagger and began to bleed. It was too dark for the other ruffians to see what was happening, so one of them called out, "Hurry it up, Sun Wu. What are you doing?" Sun Wu took a deep breath. He looked at the broken dagger, and then the sleeping Bai Xiaochun, who reeked of alcohol. Assuming that it was a problem with his dagger, he borrowed a saber from one of his fellows and then hacked it down onto Bai Xiaochun's neck. A cracking sound rang out, and Sun Wu shrieked and staggered backward, his arms vibrating so hard he worried his bones might break. He even lost his balance and fell onto the ground, the shattered remnants of the saber scattering around him. Meanwhile, Bai Xiaochun was snoring just as loudly as before, and hadn't reacted at all. To him, both the dagger and the saber had felt like little more than a mosquito landing on him. Sun Wu and his companions immediately began to sweat profusely, and their eyes went as wide as if they had seen a ghost. How is this even possible? The cold wind was no different than it always was. And yet, as it blew on the three shivering ruffians, they were soaked with sweat. An immortal, Sun Wu blurted. He's definitely an immortal. The mere thought that he had struck an immortal made Sun Wu feel like crying. In fact, he was certain that his life was about to end. So what if he's an immortal? One of the other ruffians said. I saw an immortal a few years ago, and he got gutted like a pig. Perhaps this fellow was confused about what he had seen in the past, or perhaps he was just so terrified that he wasn't thinking straight. Either way, he quickly pulled out an axe and aimed it at Bai Xiaochun's head. If he is an immortal, we're dead anyway, so we might as well go for broke. Howling, the ruffian swung the axe down with all his might. When it hit, a cracking sound could be heard as the haft of the axe shattered into pieces. As for the axe blade, it might as well have struck a boulder, and it turned into a blur of light that whizzed back and embedded itself into the ruffian's face. Before the blood could even drip down from the wound, the ruffian staggered backward, and then flopped down onto his back, dead. Sun Wu and the other ruffian were scared out of their minds. Screaming, they turned to run away. Terrified, they didn't dare to stay in the town for another night. After stealing some horses, they rode off into the night. Back at the temple, the cold wind blew over the corpse with the axe head embedded in its face. Eventually, the blood from the wound pooled around the unmoving body. Some time passed, and Bai Xiaochun managed to open his eyes. He looked at the bamboo forest, and the corpse lying next to him, and then struggled to his feet. Annoyed at having been woken up hungover, he stumbled to the tavern to buy some more alcohol. After returning, he slumped down against the wall, oblivious to his own filthy clothes and hair as he started drinking again. Before long, the alcohol allowed him to revel in his fancies and forget any painful and bitter memories. As he drank, the sky turned dark. Soon, hints of dawn could be seen on the horizon, and the inky darkness began to retreat. It was at that point that Bai Xiaochun's expression flickered with disbelief. Straining his eyes to focus, he looked at the bamboo forest not too far away, and suddenly began to tremble. In fact, his hand started shaking so hard that he dropped the jug of alcohol. There, striding out of the bamboo, was a tall man clad in a black robe. He almost seemed at one with the night, wrapped up in a sinister, ghostly energy that transformed the temple and its surrounds into an underworldly hell. The man walked up to Bai Xiaochun, loomed over him, and then let out a sigh of regret. When he spoke, it was in a voice that seemed profoundly ancient. Got any more left in that jug? Can I have some? Big bro, giant ghost. Bai Xiaochun could do little more than stare blankly at this tall man in black. Sure enough, he was none other than the giant ghost king. This was the first living friend Bai Xiaochun had encountered after arriving in the Eternal Lands. He looked much older than he had back in the Heavenspan realm. He had scars on his face. Clearly, he had experienced many trials in the more than half a year since he had been teleported to the Eternal Lands. Looking very tired, he sat down next to Bai Xiaochun. After leaning up against the temple wall, he reached out, grabbed the alcohol jug, and took a long, hard swig. Bai Xiaochun suddenly jumped to his feet and sent some divine sense out into the area. Don't bother, the giant ghost king said, not even bothering to look over. I have no idea where Zemo is, or anybody else. The only person here is me. With that, he continued to drink. Bai Xiaochun suddenly seemed to lose even the power to stay standing. He flopped to the ground, snatched the alcohol jug back from the giant ghost king, and took a drink. However, it was empty. He shook it back and forth a bit to get the last drop or two out, and then threw it off to the side. The giant ghost king didn't say anything. How did you find me? Bai Xiaochun asked, his voice hoarse. The giant ghost king produced a jug of alcohol from his bag of holding, took a long drink, then tossed it to Bai Xiaochun. By looking for half a year, in the moment when the world collapsed, Bai Xiaochun had been severely injured because of his fight with Taoist Heavenspan, and thus lost consciousness upon being teleported away. However, the giant ghost king had not lost consciousness. He had been there to watch as Bai Xiaochun was whisked away to the third immortal domain in the Vile Emperor dynasty, just as he had been. He had begun his search almost immediately. Just like Bai Xiaochun, he had found so many corpses that he eventually began to sink into bitterness and despondency. However, he had held fast to his belief that Bai Xiaochun was alive. That faith pushed him through many months until this very day, when he finally found Bai Xiaochun, wasting away outside of the temple. The truth was that the giant ghost king was in just as bad a state as Bai Xiaochun. After the war in the wildlands, the world had been destroyed, and his daughter went missing. He had once been a mighty heavenly king in the Arch-Emperor dynasty, but now, everything had changed. The wife he had taken in Giant Ghost City was also nowhere to be found. And thus, the heart of the mighty giant ghost king eventually went dark. The people he had once ruled, and his previous glory, were gone in the blink of an eye. They were a thing of the past. Here he was, alone in the eternal lands, starting over from scratch. Considering how old he was now, the idea of being back at square one caused him to sigh bitterly. It was just when things seemed to hit rock bottom that he realized that the alcohol in the eternal lands was a wonderful thing. This alcohol could get mortals drunk, and could also get immortals drunk. Bai Xiaochun took a drink, then stared off into the distance for a moment. Eventually he said, "Did you see?" Certain that the giant ghost king would know what he was talking about, he didn't finish his sentence. A moment passed, and then the giant ghost king replied, "Did I see anyone else alive? You're the only one I've encountered so far. However, I'm certain that even though a lot of people died in the teleportation, there are some who survived. I saw many of them flying through the starry sky." Bai Xiaochun looked quietly up into the night sky. As he did, there were other people on the other immortal domains of the eternal lands doing the same thing. They were in different domains, different continents, different counties. Some were in cities, and others were out in the wilderness. But all of them had the blood of the lands of Heavenspan in their veins, and all of them were looking up into an unfamiliar night sky. They were like a vast multitude of stars, flickering with their own desires, not willing to resign themselves to fate. Li Qinghao, Patriarch Spirit Stream, Master God Diviner, Xu Baosai, Zhou Zimo, Song Junwan, Bruiser was out there as well. Because of the insanity to which Bai Xiaochun had sunk, he had forgotten about Bruiser during the final hectic moments of the fighting. After being teleported into the eternal lands, Bruiser found himself among strangers, and was scared. He couldn't sense Bai Xiaochun's aura, but he could sense some familiar fluctuations. And after searching for a time, he found Song Junwan. That was when he realized that the familiar fluctuations were not coming from Song Junwan, but rather, from inside of her belly. The blood was familiar, but the aura was not. Bruiser didn't understand. However, when he saw Song Junwan's beaming smile, he knew that he had to protect her, and protect that aura inside of her. Bruiser knew that sooner or later, he would find that familiar face, which he longed to see in this strange land. The following day, the corpse was gone. The ruffians who had stolen horses and disappeared into the night would never again be seen in the world. Although Bai Xiaochun didn't care about them, the giant ghost king wanted to make sure there were no loose ends. Although the people in the town were all mortals, he still didn't want to risk word spreading that could cause trouble. The gang in town lost 3 members, and although they investigated the matter, they didn't turn up any evidence about what had happened, and quickly forgot the matter. As for Bai Xiaochun, he continued with his usual routine. However, now he didn't drink alone. Whenever he went to the tavern, he was joined by an old man. The man was tall and tough-looking. Although he was old, he was mighty and heroic, and made quite the contrast to the slim, fair Bai Xiaochun. In fact, his burly frame, the scars on his face, and his overall manly appearance made him quite attractive to many of the women in town. Eventually, a month had gone by. The giant ghost king never tried to force Bai Xiaochun to cheer up. The two of them spent their days drinking, and their nights dreaming drunken dreams. They talked a lot. The giant ghost king recalled his past glories and bragged about how incredible he had been. He even talked about how many young noblewomen had crawled into bed with him throughout the years. Eventually, Bai Xiaochun started to get bored with such stories and began to throw in some sarcastic comments here and there. At one point, he yawned and said, "Hey, remember that woman from that one clan? I forgot which clan it was. Have you forgotten who told me to go get her, and then made me the scapegoat in the whole thing? You old pervert." Nobody in the wildlands ever found out the truth. Although he wasn't as talkative as the giant ghost king, every time he said something sarcastic, it would catch the man by surprise. After a moment passed, the giant ghost king would then angrily resort to reminding Bai Xiaochun who he was. Grabbing the alcohol jug out of Bai Xiaochun's hand, he glared at him and growled, "Listen, fool, I'm your father-in-law. You think I don't know about you and Zemo? If it hadn't been for me secretly playing matchmaker, that would never have happened." Snorting coldly, he guzzled down some alcohol. Upon hearing Zhou Zemo's name, Bai Xiaochun sighed despondently. When the giant ghost king saw that, he felt a bit bad. Sighing, he said, "Hey, Xiaochun. Do you know why the arch-emperors never had many children?" Somewhat taken aback, Bai Xiaochun looked over at the giant ghost king. "Few people know the truth, but as a heavenly king, I know many things that ordinary people don't. You see, people who cultivate the undying live forever technique have much stronger male energy than ordinary cultivators. Because of that, it's impossible for them to get mortal women pregnant. And even if they get a female cultivator pregnant, it will take dozens of years or more for that masculine energy to cause the baby to form." This was Bai Xiaochun's first time hearing anything like this, and although he was a bit shocked, he actually didn't find it very surprising. As he took another drink, the giant ghost king went on to another conversation topic. Before long, Bai Xiaochun was as silent and depressed as he had been earlier. The giant ghost king sighed, and deep within his eyes, it was possible to see a glint of worry. He knew that Bai Xiaochun had suffered a much greater blow than he had. Furthermore, when it came to how many years the two of them had lived, the giant ghost king really did count as an old man compared to Bai Xiaochun. However, he wasn't hoping to immediately light a fire in Bai Xiaochun's heart. He wanted to help him recover slowly. And in fact, a month later, it was already possible to see that Bai Xiaochun was different from before. He talked a bit more, and would smile more often. Another half a month went by. The regulars at the tavern were now used to Bai Xiaochun and the old man coming to buy alcohol. Furthermore, the old man was quite different from Bai Xiaochun. He liked to talk, and before long, people got comfortable around him. Some people even noticed that the old man referred to himself as Scholar Bai's father-in-law. Eventually, people in tavern formed their own version of Bai Xiaochun's background. So, Scholar Bai's wife died, his own wife. No wonder he's been so down in the dumps. Now the two of them are relying on each other to survive. You have to admit, the world is a crazy place right now. Most of the people in the tavern would sigh sadly at the story. Bai Xiaochun and the giant ghost king began to argue more often as time went on. One evening in the temple, as the giant ghost king lounged against the wall, guzzling some alcohol, he looked over at Bai Xiaochun and said, "Xiaochun, I'm telling you, there's no flower up in the sky, just that ugly face. We're out of alcohol. Go get some more." Bai Xiaochun frowned at having his reverie interrupted. Glaring, he threw the jug over to the giant ghost king. "You go," he said. The giant ghost king sat up straight and yelled, "Bai Xiaochun. Don't think I've forgotten how you slapped me and kidnapped me. We never settled that debt. All I want you to do is go get some booze, but you come up with a million excuses. Don't forget that I'm your father-in-law." After hearing the giant ghost king call himself father-in-law for over a month, Bai Xiaochun felt like his ears were about to fall off. Glancing mischievously out of the corner of his eyes, he said, "Oh yeah, well I'm the arch-ancestor." Bai Xiaochun's words apparently caught the giant ghost king completely by surprise, and he couldn't think of anything to say. Even as he sat there, eyes turned up in thought, Bai Xiaochun's expression flickered. Then, the two of them looked at the door of the temple. Before long, the voice of a woman could be heard from outside. "Squire Zhou, Scholar Bai, I have some good news for the both of you." From the way the woman spoke, she sounded very happy and excited. Even as her words continued to echo out, she stepped into the temple. Neither young nor old, she was dressed in fine clothing, and was flanked by several handmaidens. "Well, if it isn't Madame Sun," the giant ghost king said, his eyes sparkling. Ignoring Bai Xiaochun, he rose to his feet. "Please, let's talk over here." Bai Xiaochun sighed. The giant ghost king had made quite a few friends since coming to town. Bai Xiaochun had been in the town for a lot longer than him, and yet wouldn't even have been able to guess what this woman's name was. Bai Xiaochun looked at the giant ghost king and the woman standing there off to the side talking back and forth, and couldn't help but marvel. Here was the giant ghost king, a mighty demigod, a heavenly king, acting just like a mortal. Although that in itself wasn't necessarily amazing, the fact that he even knew how to deal with mortals on the romantic side left Bai Xiaochun mostly speechless. All of a sudden, Madame Sun gently pushed the giant ghost king away from her. "You devil," she exclaimed. Eyes flashing charmingly, but expression serious, she continued, "Squire Zhou, I'm being serious here. Widow Zhang has a shop in the east part of town. Her husband died years ago, and ever since then has maintained the propriety of a widow. She's also one of the most good-looking women in town, and very rich. You're lucky to have a woman like that take a liking to you, Squire Zhou. She asked me to come here and see if you would be willing to marry into her family. If you are, then she'll give you 30% of her shop as her dowry." In response to Madame Sun's words, the giant ghost king's jaw dropped. Never could he have imagined that something like this would happen to him in a little town like this. After all, he was a mighty demigod. To marry into the family of a mortal widow would be very embarrassing. However, the truth was that despite how old he was still tall and well-built, and also very handsome. To most older women, he would be considered very attractive. Bai Xiaochun was also stunned. He looked at Madame Sun, and then at the giant ghost king, and despite how depressed he still was, couldn't help but slap his thigh and start laughing. "Congratulations, father-in-law," he said. All of a sudden, he felt the sadness and bitterness inside of him melt away a bit. The truth was that all the bickering with the giant ghost king had been slowly chipping away at the ice which held his heart locked up. And now, his laughter caused those cracks to widen and begin to fall away. In contrast, the giant ghost king was very depressed by Bai Xiaochun's words. However, even as Bai Xiaochun stood there laughing, Madame Sun looked over at him with narrowed eyes. "Oh, Scholar Bai," she said with a smile. "I'm glad you approve of the matter. Silly me, I forgot about the good news for you. Widow Zhang said that if Squire Zhou accepted her proposal, then her daughter, whose husband just died last month, and who is also very beautiful, would be the perfect match for you. If both of you agree to marry into the family, she'll give you 50% of the shop. I guess her daughter must have just been born under an ill star. Her husband was a ruffian of sorts, a real plague on the village. Supposedly, he got what was coming to him, and was tossed out into the wilderness for the animals to eat. Obviously, he's nothing like the well-educated and cultured man you are, Scholar Bai." All of a sudden, Bai Xiaochun's laughter screeched to a halt. Then, a moment later, the giant ghost king started laughing. The leaves of autumn had all fallen, and the cold of winter had set in. Although the coldest days of the season had not yet come, it was still cold enough that most people didn't want to go outside. The bite of the wind was like blades against the face. It was still possible to see a few leaves on the ground, but they were all dry and yellow, and would collapse into fragments at the slightest touch. Only once in a while would a leaf be seen dancing in the wind. But now that winter had arrived, none of them seemed willing to stay in the town, and would fly off into the distance as quickly as possible. It was in such weather that Madame Sun had left the warmth of the buildings in town and come to the dilapidated temple to talk with the father and son that lived there. After all, if she succeeded in her task, the compensation she would receive from Widow Zhang would be considerable. Because of that, she wouldn't give up easily. She tried over and over again to convince Bai Xiaochun and the giant ghost king to agree to the deal. She emphasized that for the two of them, it was the kind of rare chance that would only come around once in a blue moon, and that they definitely should not allow the opportunity to slip by. She talked up the good looks of the younger widow, and repeatedly pointed out how profitable the shop was. Over and over again, she explained out how much they would be losing out if they didn't agree. The giant ghost king wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. Despite being a demigod cultivator, there was no reason for him to be cruel in his refusal. All he could do was tell Madame Sun that they would think about the proposal, and then ask her to be on her way. After she left, he turned back to Bai Xiaochun and sighed. "See? I'm just too dashing. This is how it was back in Giant Ghost City. It was so bad I preferred to stay indoors. Whenever I went out, the women would all go crazy. Young and old alike." Although his words were spoken as if in frustration, it was impossible for him to hide how pleased he was with himself. Who would have thought that in a little town like this where nobody even knows I'm a cultivator, the same thing would happen again? I guess it's really my fault. He sighed. Bai Xiaochun wasn't exactly pleased to see the giant ghost king moaning and groaning about how amazing he was. It was worse that Widow Zhang had obviously been using Bai Xiaochun as a bargaining chip to try to gain the giant ghost king's approval. Otherwise, why else would she have offered her daughter to Bai Xiaochun in marriage after she had only been widowed for a month? I can't believe that I, Bai Xiaochun, am not even as attractive to these mortals as this old fogey. Not willing to accept the truth of it, he looked at the preening giant ghost king out of the corner of his eye and snorted coldly. Congratulations, father-in-law. Who would have thought that you would put down roots in this little town? I'm sure you'll really prosper here. You absolutely, positively must not refuse the offer. Oh, you'll also need alcohol for the wedding. So why don't you go get another jug? By force of habit, the giant ghost king glared at Bai Xiaochun and prepared to start arguing. But then he rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Now that I think about, I remember seeing this widow Zhang before. I'm pretty sure I passed her on the street on the way to get alcohol. If I remember, she blushed when she saw me. She's actually pretty good looking. Nice figure, attractive rear end, a real hottie. The giant ghost king's eyes began to shine brightly, especially upon describing what widow Zhang looked like. Wait, hold on a second. I should head over to that shop to double check. After all, she's making an offer in good faith, and I've always been a straightforward and candid person. I can't take advantage of her good faith. The giant ghost king had been somewhat of a pervert even back in the wildlands, especially when it came to attractive women of his own age. That much was obvious from how he had secretly asked Bai Xiaochun to bring him that one particular woman from the clan outside of Giant Ghost City. Here he was, down and out in the Eternal Lands, and yet his personality hadn't changed. Now that his passions were aroused, he didn't care what kind of sarcastic things Bai Xiaochun said. Full of zest, he hurried out of the temple. Xiaochun, he called over his shoulder. You'll have to drink alone today. I'll be back later. Bai Xiaochun was a bit stunned. Although he knew of the giant ghost king's lecherous nature, he would never have been able to guess that the man would even be attracted to mortal women. How could a demigod expert be like that? Bai Xiaochun smiled wryly at how eagerly the giant ghost king rushed out of the temple, and was about to yell something after him when, all of a sudden his eyes flickered, and then began to shine with a light much more intense than anything which had appeared in them in recent days. He wasn't the only one to react in such a way. The giant ghost king suddenly stopped in his tracks and looked up. Instead of the fiery light of passion which had just been burning in his eyes, his expression was now as cold as Bai Xiaochun's. The biting winter wind wasn't even close to being as cold as their gazes, and in fact, it didn't dare to remain, and died down. Moments later, a whistling sound filled the air, along with 3 distant beams of bright light. As they got closer to the town, it was possible to see that within them were 3 diva cultivators, natives of the Eternal Lands. 2 of them simply continued to fly overhead, but the third, a middle-aged man with an intimidating expression on his face, came to a stop in midair above the town. As he did, he unleashed a diva aura that caused rumbling to fill the air like heavenly thunder. All of the mortals in the town began to tremble in fear, and no matter where they were or what they were doing, dropped to kowtow to the figure up above. In the Eternal Lands, mortals didn't view the immortals as figures of legend and myth. Although they didn't necessarily see them every day, they were by no means rare. In fact, even this small town had an official residence set aside for them. As the diva fluctuations filled the town, 4 figures emerged from a rather large pagoda. They quickly flew up into the air toward the diva, and then kowtowed in greeting. One of them was the old man who had taken his apprentice to the temple some time ago, the core formation cultivator. Another of the 4 was that very apprentice, the boy who was in the chi condensation level. The other 2 were young men, both of whom had foundation establishment cultivation bases. The entire group was visibly sweating as they greeted the diva. Greetings, immortal, the old man said respectfully. The diva looked at the man with a piercing gaze, then clasped his hands behind his back and spoke in a voice that echoed out like thunder in all directions. I bear orders from the demigod preceptor of Crosspeak Prefecture, Master Dust Origin. All inhabitants of Crosspeak Prefecture are hereby commanded to participate in the manhunt for people from the Heavenspan realm. Every single one of them must be tracked down and delivered to the local prefecture, even the corpses. Anyone who harbors or assists refugees from the Heavenspan realm will be severely punished, and possibly have their clan exterminated. If anyone is found guilty of negligence by allowing Heavenspan cultivators to reside in the area, they will have their cultivation base crippled. There will be no leniency in this regard. And anyone willfully violating any of these orders will bring greater disaster onto themselves than they can possibly imagine. Of special importance are any Heavenspan cultivators in the Foundation establishment level or higher. Hold nothing back to capture them. Anyone who does will be handsomely rewarded by the vile emperor. His words were spoken in callous and grim fashion, and left everyone in the town trembling, especially the core formation cultivator. Wiping the sweat from his brow, he said, "We will follow the orders of the preceptor down to the smallest aspect. If any heavenspan denizens appear in our area, we will put our lives on the line to do just as the vile emperor and the preceptor command." The diva nodded slowly, then scanned the area with divine sense. Finding nothing unusual, he turned and sped off into the distance to the next location on his list of places to make the announcement. Generally speaking, a voice transmission would have been sufficient, but in order to emphasize the importance of the matter, this diva and his compatriots were personally taking the announcement to everyone in Crosspeak Prefecture, and simultaneously inspecting the area. After the diva left, the town did not simply go back to business as usual. No one would dare to take the words of a diva lightly, and thus the old man in the core formation stage immediately passed down orders, instructing the gang in town to perform a thorough search. Back in the temple, Bai Xiaochun's eyes shone with cold light, as did the giant ghost king's. "I could smell the blood of heavenspan cultivators on him," Bai Xiaochun said. The giant ghost king snorted and flew up into the air. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.